Today we're painting Convergence for the Grimcoven board game. Like so many miniatures from this game, there is a lot going on here. This particular Griefbound is an amalgamation of a dwarven alchemist and the breath of the deity that he controls. This miniature has a multitude of small details scattered throughout the sculpt. I'll paint these small details in a fairly routine manner, dedicating only a small amount of time to describing how I'm painting them. I'll dedicate more time to explaining the more unusual aspects of this miniature, such as the unique electric blue coming from within the storm of the deity's breath. Welcome to Treehane Miniatures. I prepped this miniature first by using a dark blue paint and primer in one. Because this paint has a satin finish, I decided to finish the priming with a clear matte varnish. This will help the acrylic paints better adhere to the model. I prepped this Convergence miniature before I decided that I wasn't going to use any oil paints on these Grimcoven miniatures. Therefore, I will demonstrate two different ways to achieve the bright blue glow coming from within the deity's breath. First, I'll demonstrate using a white acrylic wash followed by glazing in the glow with a standard brush. Then we'll cut to how I actually prepared this model using a white oil wash and an airbrush. A while ago, I made a video comparing an acrylic whitewash to an oil whitewash. I used Mysterio from the Marvel Zombies board game to demonstrate how to use an acrylic whitewash to create a glowing smoke effect on the base of the miniature. I first had to establish the mid-tone color for the smoke. This step is unnecessary with Convergence since the dark blue primer will serve as the base color for the storm that is the deity's breath. Then I mix up some white acrylic wash using airbrush flow improver and titanium white acrylic ink. This is a very fluid mix, using up to 2 parts flow improver to 1 part ink. This amount of flow improver isn't necessary to get the white ink to flow into the recesses, but it will help minimize surface staining on the raised surfaces. First, I demonstrate how the reduced surface tension of the liquid and capillary action work to draw this wash into the recesses. Then I get lazy and slather it all over every surface. One key difference with acrylic washes is that any surface staining needs to be dealt with before the wash dries. I work in sections, applying the wash to a small area and then gently removing it from the raised surfaces of the smoke before the wash dries. This time crunch is non-existent with an oil wash, as it's much more forgiving to work with. Then we'll use fluorescent acrylic ink in a standard brush to apply the ink like a wash in all of the cracks and crevices of the smoke. I'm personally not using fluorescent ink for my version of Convergence, but fluorescent blue ink is a fine choice for the storm cloud look that we're going for with this model. The next step is to darken the raised surfaces of the smoke cloud, but we'll get to that once we've converged the acrylic wash and the oil wash methods together. Once you get past the hassle of making an oil pin wash, this process is much easier than the acrylic wash. This wash is made up of 15 to 20 parts odorless mineral spirits to 1 part oil paint. This is an incredibly fluid mixture. It flows effortlessly into the recesses. There is no rush with this process. We can let the wash completely dry before cleaning up the raised surfaces of the smoke. In fact, we want the wash to be mostly dry before removing it with a sponge. If the wash is still fresh, we run the risk of absorbing the whitewash out of the recesses with the sponge. Since this wash is applied directly over the paint and primer in one, I'm actually not being too careful here. I'm also not using any mineral spirits to remove more of the wash from the surface. A little surface staining is perfectly acceptable since it will smooth the transition from the bright region to the darker parts of the cloud. I'm using Phantasmal Blue through an airbrush for the internal glow of the storm clouds. Since I'm using air paint, I have it thinned only with flow improver. If I were using a thicker hobby paint, I'd thin it with airbrush thinner as well. I like to use very thin paint through my airbrush with the air compressor set fairly low. I have this set to about 15 psi or 1 bar. Whether you decide to use an airbrush or a translucent wash for this step, hitting the surrounding billowing storm clouds is fine. The key with this step is to get that bright internal glow. We'll address the rest of the deity's breath in the following steps. Now that we've used one of the 2 methods to get the internal glow for the deity, we can increase the darkness of the surrounding clouds. I want this to look like an electrical storm cloud with a very bright electric blue interior, with dark blue-gray storm clouds surrounding it. I'm starting fairly dark with Iron Wolf by the Army Painter, and I'm dry brushing this color into place. I'm opting for a very soft makeup brush for this application instead of the usual goat hair dry brush, which is much coarser. I use a very light touch so that just the tips of the bristles touch the raised surfaces of the model. There is very little risk of this color adhering within the recesses, but I don't want to take any chances. I take the darkness level up a notch and dry brush on some Payne's Gray Pro Acryl. This is the darkest gray paint that we'll use for the deity's breath. Dry brushing this coat into place makes for a great transition from the Iron Wolf layer that came before, but dry brushing alone won't get this dark enough. Once I've got everything covered to my satisfaction with the dry brush, I switch to a standard brush to make the outermost parts of the cloud a little darker. I'm using a layer consistency for this application of paint. The model is textured enough that this application of paint doesn't need to be too precise. I just need to make sure that I leave some of the previous layers visible so there's a natural transition to this darker shade of gray. And this is going to wrap up the smoky electrical storm portion of this piece. I spent a little more time with this because I feel that this is the main attraction of this model and one that deserves more attention. I'm going to quickly cover the more mundane aspects of this paint up. I'll slow it back down for the more interesting stuff later on. I'm using Necromancer Cloak to base coat most of the objects within this whirling storm. This includes all of the chains, anything that looks like it's made out of concrete, and the Alchemist's Cloak. I finish up the Alchemist's Cloak by highlighting with a mix of Necromancer Cloak and Ice Yellow. This is done in a couple of passes, adding a little more Ice Yellow to the mix with each pass. I use Vallejo Hull Red to base coat the exposed parts of the Alchemist, like his abdomen, face, and arms. I'm also using this on what I believe to be lament flowing from underneath the Alchemist. There are several parts of this sculpture that I am not quite sure what they're supposed to be. For example, I don't know whether these long branching cylindrical features are supposed to be lament or uprooted trees and roots. So I decided to base coat those with Hull Red as well. With a dark reddish-brown base coat, I can make them look like branches or red lament, once I've decided how I want to paint them. The rest of the base gets covered in German Camo Black-Brown. I want to get everything covered in a simple base coat before proceeding with the rust effect. Applying the rust can be messy. If I screw up any of the surrounding areas, I can always fix them later with the highlight step. I prepare to use Dirty Down Rust by warming it and the miniature in front of a small space heater until they're both warm to the touch. I do this right on my painting desk. I'll leave the space heater running while I work the Dirty Down Rust over the model. If the model and rust cool down too much, the rust effect may not bloom properly. I'm being pretty careful as I paint this onto all of the metal objects on the miniature. This stuff is water soluble, so it can be cleaned up with a little water if I miss my mark. However, I find that it still leaves a slight amount of orange staining behind after being cleaned up. After all of the chains are covered, I decide to use the Dirty Down Rust on the concrete items to dirty them up a bit. On these items, I will use water to soften the rust effect. I want the concrete features to look dingy, not rusty. This Dirty Down Rust works great for that also. I thought that I might want to go with a greenish hue for the large skull on this guy, so I tested it out on these smaller skulls first. I begin with a base coat of Angel Green. Then I layer some Army Green on top of that. I finish off the tiny skulls with Necrotic Flesh. Necrotic Flesh is actually a great looking bone color. However, the green layers underneath aren't working as well for me. I'll go in a different direction for the main skull. I also use Necrotic Flesh to highlight the Alchemist's arms, face, and abdomen. To finish painting the Alchemist, I use glistening blood over the Necrotic Flesh highlights on his face and abdomen. I finish off all of the concrete and stone items with a highlight of uniform gray. No part of this miniature is getting highlighted to the same degree that I would usually highlight a miniature. I want the brightest part of the miniature to be the internal glow of the deity's breath. So I decide that I'm going to call the long spindly things on this miniature branches. I'm using 3 different colored paints to stipple into place over these branches. I'll use ochre brown and leather brown to build some highlights on the upward facing areas. I'll use German camo black brown to create shadows under the whole red layer. I dab army green over the ground that was previously coated with German camo black brown. I'm using scarlet blood to build up the red lament that's flowing from within this deity. I'm covering much of the whole red, leaving it visible only in the depressed regions of the flow. I want this lament to have a fluid quality to it, so I'm going to brighten it significantly with titanium white. I'm applying this to the edges of the waves or ripples or whatever they are. Again, I'm not really sure if I'm reading the features of this model correctly, but I eventually had to settle on an idea for painting this griefbound, and this is what I came up with. The final touch for the lament is to use glistening blood over the white highlights. Glistening blood is a translucent effect paint, so I'm not thinning this at all before applying it over the white. I fear that thinning this paint may result in a pink finish, which I do not want. I have been putting off painting the large skull because I did not have a clear vision for how I want it to look. But it's time to bite the bullet and commit to something. I begin by cleaning up the airbrush overspray with a coat of Payne's Gray Pro Acryl. I'm only using a couple of colors for this skull. The next layer is a mix of Payne's Gray and Necrotic Flesh. The next layer is the main color for the skull, which is Necrotic Flesh. This is a fairly large jump in color value, so I'm applying the Necrotic Flesh in thin layers. I will build up the intensity of color in several layers. I'll do this imperfectly to create some texture, imperfections, and shadows as I go. This is the most time-consuming step for the skull. The rest is a breeze. I use a dry brush to stipple army green over the skull, creating more imperfections and texture. So I guess in a way I did kind of go with my original paint scheme for the skulls. The final step for the skull is to dot in a few ice yellow highlights. And now we're going to close out this paint job by using a couple of metallic paints over the rust effect. I'm using gunmetal on the chains, and I'm using bronze over the other metallic accent items. I actually had a lot of fun painting this griefbound, despite the fact that the complexity of the sculpt seemed overwhelming at first. The most stressful part of painting this character was simply deciding what colors I wanted for each part of the miniature. Once that was decided, things progressed smoothly. I'd like to thank my amazing channel members for supporting all that I do on this channel. You too can become a channel member using the link in the description and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you decide which miniature I paint next. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of deity summoners.